Okay, we start. There is another simultaneous panel happening in the other hall, so the 400 people have split. So I'm very happy to open the panel discussion about the future of the state. We will not attempt to compete with the World Economic Forum Global Future Councils meeting in Dubai on November 10 and 11, where 700 futurists gather to discuss about innovative ideas for the future world. But nevertheless, we have very distinguished lineup of panelists who have already done a lot of very progressive things and certainly have a view of how the world is going to be shaped in the near future. So without much additional discussion, I would like to introduce you from furthest away from me, Francis Malij, Managing Director for EBRD for Eastern Europe and Caucasus. He is responsible for banks business in 6 countries, Ukraine being obviously the largest, Moldova as well, 3 Caucasus countries and Belarus. And among other things, Francis, a good friend, is a member of the board of Ukrainian Corporate Governance Academy that we recently have set up here in Kiev. Thank you, Francis, for coming here. Andrius Kubilius, all over TV in the recent days in Kiev as the mastermind behind the Marshall Plan for Ukraine. Andrius has been twice at the steering wheel of Lithuania as a prime minister, including during extremely difficult period post-financial crisis in 2008. I was flying from Vilnius to Kiev yesterday, and a person next to me sitting said that Andrius is the type of leader that is born only once every 100 years, and said that possibly the best prime minister Lithuania has ever had. So we have him here. I'm very pleased with that. He will have to leave us about 10 minutes before the end. And last but not least, Taavi Rivas, until not so long ago, the youngest prime minister in the European Union. Taavi was in charge of the Estonian government during 2014 and 2016. Now is a member of European Parliament and is Estonian Parliament and is obviously a very prominent leader. He came to prominence with a number of initiatives, including handing out Angela Merkel e-citizenship not long ago. And I remember while you were still prime minister, you wrote on Twitter that you just completed your income declaration for the previous year on your smartphone in 2 minutes, and you did that having breakfast at the same time. So Taavi is already living in the 22nd century, unlike most of us, and will tell us more about those things. So why don't we kick off? I just ran across a headline in preparation for this Global Futures Forum in Dubai, where a member of the Danish Parliament, Ida Auken, said, "Welcome to 2030. I own nothing, no car, no house, no home appliances, no clothes. I have no privacy, and life has never been better." So this is her view of what 2030 is going to look like. And many people focus already on the year 2030 and slightly beyond, because things are changing so quickly. So why don't we quickly go through our speakers and have some sort of reflections in terms of what type of world do you expect we're going to live in by the year 2030? More peaceful, more equal, or rather more more fair, more frightening, or perhaps more populated and more polluted, you know, with more warfares. Yeah, so Taavi, perhaps let's start with you.
Thank you. Well, to believe that in 13 years' time there will be a revolution on all the issues is rather optimistic in my vision. I think, for example, the feelings towards ownership of things will change, not in years or decades, but will change together with generations. I still grew up in the 80s when owning a car was something that, was for a lifetime. We bought the Lada for a lifetime, and that was, a big thing in our family. Everybody celebrated that. Most families didn't even have the Lada, as you obviously remember. Now, my generation is much less to car ownership. I take car as something that I need to pay for every month. This is a leasing for me, and this is more of an obligation than a property. And my daughter is the generation, she's 8 right now. She doesn't really care about owning a car or leasing a car. She probably just looks for the best way for transportation. And it might not be a car, it might be something totally different. So I think that over generations, we will see large transformation in things of how we feel about ownership and things like that. Now, having said that, I think the change that we will experience in the next few decades will be much faster than the previous decades. And telling it in Ukraine, where we have seen very, very big changes in the last 25 to 26 years, it means that we have to be ready for even faster changes. And why I believe that, of course, there's one simple word: technology. Some people are arguing whether there will be technological revolution or not. I think this is not a question of argument. This is something that is already happening, and some of the countries try to somehow postpone it because they are afraid that the jobs of today are disappearing. But I believe that there is actually no way of regulate any country away from technological progress. Technological progress is something that will change our lives, that will disrupt the future or the way we see the future happening without technology, and will be the single biggest influencer of what the world will look like in 2030 or 2050 or whatever the year.
Andres?
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot. Really, it's amazing, to speak really about long-term future. In politics, usually we are, our agenda is to look into what is happening today and what will happen tomorrow, and it's really big fun to have such an opportunity, really, to try to elaborate some ideas and some thoughts about how our long-term future can look like. And I remember immediately, my personal feelings. Maybe I'm here, I don't know, the oldest guy looks like, And I was twice prime minister, like Ivara said. But I remember my second term from 2008 till 2012, we were hit by a global crisis and so on and so on. And my biggest happiness was that I got the first granddaughter. In 2009, she was born, Elsa. And then suddenly it appeared to me that if she will be in a good health condition, she can live till this age will end. 91-year-old, she can meet, 2,100 year, coming into the life. And I asked myself, so what she will see? And my answer was really very confused, because I can imagine that she will see totally different technologies, totally different, conditions of life. Maybe I hope that the peace still will keep, in our globe, in our region, being part of our life. It would be really something unbelievable that the peace in Europe is staying for. Now we have 70 years of peace, To imagine that next 90 years peace will be here, it's something unbelievable again. But, well, that's my dream. Then, of course, looking to some kind of more close future, being prime minister, I asked my government to elaborate what we called at that time Strategy Lithuania 2030. Looking into next 20 years. So what, as a country, as a state, we're looking for. Of course, we are looking for much better, you know, economical and social life in Lithuania, and we were looking how we can adapt ourselves to all the forthcoming, you know, changes, technological changes, at least how to become better than Estonians. That is our major dream always, you know. That is moving us forward, you know. So we put that strategy, you know, again, and I was quite heavily influenced at that time when we were putting that strategy with my meeting in Jerusalem, in Israel, with at that time President late you know, Shimon Peres. Recently, if you have read, he had a very nice biography book, which has very good title, No Room for Small Dreams. And I spent 1 hour with him in an official meeting, and after some, you know, small talk about weather and so on, suddenly I started to feel that he is going to explain me something big. And being 90 years old, he explained me how new technologies, nanotechnologies, will be developed, how it will influence, you know, research of brain and so on and so on. I was totally amazed, totally shocked, you know, by his knowledge and his, you know, and his style of really having big dreams. And that is what we need always when we are you know, when we are in some leadership of the country or in politics or even in daily life. We need to allow ourselves to have big dreams, because really it's, you know, it's we need to understand that like Tavis said, you know, things will develop in a very rapid way. Technologies will change itself, you know. We don't know how what will happen, you know, in next 20 years. I remember very well, and that is why we need to have those, you know, big dreams, not to stay only on daily, you know, agenda. At the end I will tell you the story, you know, how I joined politics back in 1988. We had Popular Front in Lithuania, and I remember very well, you know, my first surprise. I am from physics, you know, my background is physics, and in headquarters of our Popular Front, you know, I remember very well when Lithuanians from Chicago came and they brought fax machine. The first fax machine, which I haven't seen before that, you know, in Lithuania, nothing. And they explained, somebody connected it to telecommunications, and they said, okay, Lithuanians from Chicago are sending us some kind of, you know, statement. I was not able to understand how it can work. Okay, then it was working. Okay, we had a lot of fax machines everywhere, in all our offices. Now when I'm asking graduates of gymnasiums, do you know what does it mean, fax machine? Nobody knows at all. Which means that technologies are moving in such a rapid way that, you know, to stay and not to dream about big changes, it would be a big mistake. But also, my final conclusion is very simple. As we see from our own experience, we are very good in adapting ourselves to so big changes. So let's not be afraid of, you know, big changes. We shall survive. Let's have big dreams, and let's feel good fun, you know, of all what is happening.
Thank you, Alvarez, for inviting me. I feel a bit intimidated to be speaking after two former prime ministers. This must be a line missing in my resume somewhere.
It's never too late.
Big dream, big dream.
Exactly, it's a big dream. But you know, as I was looking at this topic, I was reading through some material and realizing that coming across a study that says that under currently available and demonstrated technology, about half of the global workforce can be replaced by automation. Right? So you guys, you're fired. Right? You guys can stay, but you guys, you're fired. Right? But it's not going to happen that way, of course, because some jobs are 100% automatable, some are 20% automatable, some are 60% automatable. But the scope of change that is possible using currently available technology is just huge. And of course, that's not even counting the development of artificial intelligence, the development of technologies that are not yet available. And so now, when I saw this number, 50%, how scary is that number? Well, in fact, I think it depends on how fast this comes. If you look at the jobs that we had in 1900, more than 50% of them have gone, way more, right? Like by then in 1900 across Europe, probably more than 40–50% of the people were working the fields. And now it's only 2 or 3% in most countries. So already 47% of the working population, their job is gone, right? But because it happened over a long period of time, it didn't matter so much. We created many jobs that didn't exist when we set out on this process, on this industrial revolution, and it didn't matter so much. The problem we have now, and if you look back at the past, let's say 30 years, what do you see? You see that there's a big rise in inequality, that there's a few people that have made much better in advanced economies, but that there's also a large number of people that are worse. And you know, if you listen to economists, they'll tell you that happiness is a function of two things, basically. Am I better off than last year? And how am I doing as compared to my neighbors? If I'm better off than last year and I'm doing better than my neighbors, I'm a happy guy. Right? And so the problem we've had over the past 30 years, certainly in the US, in Western Europe and so on, is that we've actually fared very, very badly on these two simple criteria. And we've compounded that with an access to information. Okay? My kids don't know what is a situation where you had a question and you needed to go through an encyclopedia, a book, to find the answer, right? Google didn't exist when I was a kid. So there was a lot of value in having books where you could go for the information. Now you can't, and this transparency heightens this feeling of inequality, because it makes it even easier to see that you're not as well off as your neighbor, right? And so that explains a lot of the populism that we see, that explains a lot of these tendencies. Now, coming back to if we are in 2030, I don't know about that lady, but I'm still going to own my suit and my shirts and my car, probably, and my home. Because you know what? I believe these type of statements are fair weather strategies. By which I mean, if everything's going well in your life, you can have a nice house, you can pay for it, and you can afford the risk that tomorrow, if you lose your job, it's going to stop all of it. But if you think a little bit ahead about the risk in life, about the risk that you're going to lose your job and so on, you say, okay, I'm going to lose my job, so that means that the kids are not going to school anymore because I can't afford to pay. I'm going to live on the street because I can't afford to pay the house. And by the way, I'm going to go naked because the rent for the suit, I can't afford it anymore either. Right? So there's a value in owning things, and it's security. And so I don't think that in 2030, no one will own a house anymore. I think the vast majority of the people that own a house today will own a house in 2030, and I also think that the vast majority of people who want to buy a house today will have gone on with that big dream of theirs by then. Now, this is not to say, of course, we are not faced with monumental change in economy and in our lives, and I think for a country like, first of all, for advanced economies, it means we need to find a way to reorganize society so that the people that have been left behind by the forces of globalization do not become forces for unrest, for war, for populism, and so on and so forth. And that probably means not only finding a way to pay people a minimum revenue, like, you know, I think Finland, for example, is trying right now to pay a minimum revenue to people whether they work or not, but also to find a meaning of life when you're not working. Remember, as long as life has existed, it's formalized in the Bible, but the Bible is, you know, formalizing things that existed before. You know, I went to the Genesis book this morning early because, you know, I woke up early, all right? So what does it say? Man, Adam, because in the Bible only Adam is working, right? Eve is not working, so it's something that we've made progress at least on that front in the past, you know, 5,000 years or so. So Adam says, is told by God, by the sweat of your face, you shall eat bread until you return to the ground. So work is central to the life, okay? And so what do we do now if we say to people, okay, again, half the room, sorry, the other half this time, so I don't want to single you guys out. Okay, you will never have to work. We'll give you a little bit of money so you can survive. All right? But what's the meaning of your life? And we need to invent this because there's no answer. As long as we've had a civilization, people have worked and people have met in the marketplace, traded with each other, and that's a big content, again, of happiness of people. Right? So I think that's a major change we're going to see in the next 30 years. It's going to be gradual. It's not going to be everywhere. It's certainly not going to be in Ukraine yet, I think. And another important aspect that I think we are going to see massive change in is the aspect of using technology and cybersecurity, right? Just to take an example, who among you is carrying a map of a city that they don't know anymore? You don't, you carry a cell phone, right? You've got Google Maps in there, or another map app or whatever, but you know, and suddenly GPS stops. There's a cyber attack on the GPS system. We're all completely lost, right? We're completely screwed, right? We can't move anywhere. We can't find our way. And it's true at the anecdotal level for a visitor in a city that they don't know. But it's also true of a grid for electricity. It's also true for your self-driving car. Someone pirates it. And then the whole of the system goes astray. Everyone has an accident and so on and so forth. Right? So this is something that I think is going to be one of the main dangers we are going to have to face in the next 30 to 40 years. It's been seen as an example in Ukraine last year. Now, just to conclude quickly on a country like Ukraine, and what can a country do to kind of accompany these moves? One is every country has to invest a lot in education.
We will touch base on what
we'll do that. And recommendations come later. Okay, so I've concluded then.
Later. And regardless how much I like you, and I agree with you that you should keep your suit, I will also would not like you to live in my house, when I'm at work either. So to get participants to get involved a bit, why don't we put up the first question? Because we'll drill deeper into the questions of changes to society, healthcare, and the way government functions in the future. So if organizers could put the first question, then prepare your voting devices. Okay, so what is a less distant reality? A, people will live until 150 years old. B, Bitcoin, which is $7,500 per unit, will reach $1 million per unit. C, the world is going to zero carbon, zero poverty. D, people will have sex with robots. And by the way, last week, Japanese announced that they invented a robot that makes love better than a human being. And E, Ukraine will become corruption-free. So, please start voting. Okay, good. It's a really interesting conclusion, and I must say, people are also very optimistic about the Ukrainian prospects, which is good. We'll discuss that, and certainly the cryptocurrency evangelists will not be very satisfied with our view towards the Bitcoin. Why don't we have the second question right away? Okay, this is the future of work. We just started to discuss that. So how it's gonna be? A, we will work less and be paid less. We will work more and be paid more. Or we will work less and be paid more. So ideal scenario, of course. D, government will pay many of us not to work. Some, I guess, wish that. And E, nothing will change. Okay, let us see the results. Work less and be paid more, of course, ideal scenario. Ideal scenario, or nothing will change, which is also obviously a base case scenario if you don't expect anything radical. But this is exactly why we're here. So let's drill into these topics and go straight to the core of the work. I mean, Tavi, you are very close to Finland. 30% of words in Estonian are the same as Finnish. You obviously copycat many things in Finland like Lithuanians do in your country. And Finns just experimented around with a minimum guaranteed income provided by the state, regardless of whether you lay in front of a TV and play video games or do anything else with your life. I mean, what's your view about those type of things?
Well, I'm quite critical on this because, just like Francis said, working is not just a way of making a living, but working is also a person's way to feel important, to contribute to the society. You know, if you look at the hierarchy of our needs, it's not only the basic things, not only air, food, and the clothes, but it's also to be recognized, to feel needed. So in this respect, I think that having a big part of society left aside is not a very sustainable model, and I don't think that universal pay for all people could actually make our society happier. It's not about physical goods and services only, it's about happiness and feeling the prosperity. But on the future of work, I was one of those who pressed C because I believe that the technology and the development will actually help us to have higher productivity. This has happened over the previous centuries, and there is no need for it not to happen over the next decades and centuries. The only thing is it will happen much faster. Like Andrew was talking about the fax machine being a big news 30 years ago, also probably not only Lithuania but also here and in Estonia, and already 10 years ago this device was invented. This is iPhone, for those who haven't seen it, and this is something that carries a fax machine, TV recorder, VHS, cassette player, CD-ROM, you know, camera, dictaphone. Like you still needed 30 years ago a room to fit all this technology. In '88, I remember I had a dream of having a carry-on TV because I saw it in the ads somewhere in US. You know, today I carry on much more than just the TV, and this has happened in 2 to 3 decades. Now, if we envision what will happen by 2030 or even 30 years from now, we should not be visioning ourselves using iPhone 20 or iPhone 50. That will not be the case anymore. There will be something totally different. We will still communicate, we will still probably record our memories, but I would expect it to happen much faster, going to different technological platforms. And now coming to the point of your question, what does it mean for us and our working life? I believe that perhaps there will be even more than 50% of the jobs gone, but this won't mean that this part of the hall will be fired. This will mean that not only this part of the hall, but probably most of us will actually have completely different jobs. We will still need people probably either programming some devices to do something, or we still need people who design the services, or, you know, if I would knew what all the jobs will be looking like, I would probably be a billionaire already, which I unfortunately am not. Unfortunately, I know, still very far from that. But I think that you don't need to be a genius to understand that the jobs will change, and there is a need for many other kinds of jobs. So if some of you has son or daughter asking you career advice, I would clearly recommend you not to tell them to learn driving a bus, for example. In 2 decades, if not 1 or 15 years or whatever, there won't be a need for people driving buses, which also means that most of us will actually enjoy the luxury of having a chauffeur without actually human being driving us around, which actually means that all of us have much more time for some productivity that prime ministers are used to doing, sitting on the back seat of the car. By the way, in prime minister's life, sitting in the back seat of a car is probably the only free time you have to check your emails or read the memos that your advisors are having. So congratulations, all of us can enjoy that luxury in the future. So concluding my point, I'm rather optimistic about the future of work. We will still be working, we will still feel ourselves important. The nature of the work will be less physical and much more harder on our brains. We will need to have more skills. When I graduated high school, higher education, bachelor degree was considered to be the basis of a good education, or the kind of default level. Today it's the master's degree. When my daughter will graduate in 30 or 25 years, she will probably need something higher than master's degree to feel that this is the kind of default level. So this is also something that needs to be kept in mind.
Andrus, in addition to the guaranteed minimum income experimented around by the Finns, Swedes also experimenting with a shorter working day, 6 hours instead of 8. I am personally a fan of that for countries with strong management models, high labor productivity and so on. What is your view, towards the things that Tavi already spoke about in the shorter work day, perhaps?
Well, if to be very precise, well, shorter days usually are introduced to fight unemployment. I'm not so sure if that is the only way what we need to do. But of course, it's very difficult to predict now how the whole social, fabric will develop itself. But, for more than 10 years I was leading Lithuanian Conservative Party. I'm very much conservative in my attitude towards how things will develop. I think that we need to look into the history, what tendencies we have seen in the history, and we can predict what is coming. No big miracles will happen. So I absolutely agree with what Francis was quoting, Bible. We can quote even Marx or Engels, They were speaking about that the work, created human being out from monkey or apes, and that's why we cannot look into the future trying to see maybe there will be no job at all, We shall be lazy. If we shall be lazy without a work, we shall come back to status of monkeys, and that will be not very good. So from another point of view, really, we need to see that things can change in a very dynamic way. And I am looking into positive change. Recently I read one book, I even have the title Age of Discovery by Jan Goldin and Chris Kutarna. Very interesting book, which compares developments of today with Renaissance developments. Putting very simple message that Renaissance was created by Gutenberg invention of printing press. Now internet, Facebook and all that communication is playing similar role. And you remember that the Renaissance was 100 years of big discoveries, big changes, everything, from Copernic till Leonardo da Vinci, were in that 100 years happening. So maybe we are facing, also some kind of this, 100 years of big discoveries. which can bring really a lot of change into our social fabric. But it does not mean that those changes will be negative. Again, I remember very well, something like 10 years ago, I read Finnish paper published by, they have in Finland very good invention, which Estonians will follow very soon, and then we shall do it. They have a so-called future committee in the parliament, and they are publishing some kind of those, you know, publications about how things can develop. And that was a paper about how Finnish economy will look like in several decades. And that was still, Nokia was in the top, you know. And they said, okay, but IT perhaps will not be the most important field of economy for Finland, you know, in 50 years' time. But I remember what they put, and it was for me quite a novelty. They put that what will be most important. They called it economy of old age, to take care about old age people. And second was also economy of culture, that people will have much more time to spend for some kind of cultural activities, and that will be again some kind of new field of economy. So let's be ready for such developments.
Francis, okay, politicians tell us that we're going to have to continue working
Yes.
And then be paid, I guess, pretty much the same. But in the first voting, the first option was that you know, human beings will soon live until 150 years. And
Yes.
I personally believe that certainly our children of our children will live to 150 years. This is my deep sort of a conviction. And we discussed with you briefly about that, maybe even until 200 years. I mean, what implications will it have for everyday lives and for countries and for healthcare, in your opinion?
Well, it has profound implications. Just to say one thing on the working time, though, I think it's really person dependent. Meaning, I remember when we introduced the 35-hour work week in France back in 2000. And at the time I was working as a consultant, and the joke was, well, 35 hours, that's Tuesday night. Because the rule was like 16-hour days, kind of, right? And I'm sure that for a prime minister, even if all the compatriots work 6-hour days, it will still be a 14, 15, 16-hour day. And so it's really highly dependent. And I'm not, in other words, what I'm trying to say is I'm not worried about the working time and the working pay for the elite people, for the people that have a high education, that have highly complex jobs and so on. I'm more worried about the pay that we give to people that are on the lower end of the scale. But going to the healthcare, it's clear that there is huge progress in that technology as in other technologies. And that results in the ability of people to change over some parts of their bodies. Like hip replacement has been around for a while, but maybe tomorrow better, and other things. Heart replacements are progressing. You see now the development of specifically developed medicine that are actually tailored to one person's particular genetic material and go after a genetic disease that they have. So that's all extremely good. That could lead to fighting cancer in a much better way, fighting diseases like Alzheimer's in a much better way, and so on and so forth. However, that also means that it's becoming increasingly costly to treat a person. If you need to develop a piece of medication specifically for one person, it's extremely costly. And you have then two impacts on society. One is, you know, how does it feel to live to 200 years old? How does it feel to, some people even dream that they can download their brain into a new being, right? And that they can then live forever. So yeah, how does it feel to have, you know, to know that your boss is going to retire in 120 years? And what do you do in the meantime? How do you progress your career, right? How does it feel to know that in countries where the presidents become prime ministers and presidents again, and that could last for another 20 cycles? Does anyone look forward to this? Right? And so again, as a society, we don't have an answer to these questions. So of course people will have to work longer hours. When we started the retirement, you know, the welfare state back at the end of the Second World War, we sent people to retire at 65 when the life expectancy was 69. Now we send them to retire at 60 or 58 or something when the life of expectancy is 80. So it completely transforms the way society works. It does create some opportunity. I agree with the, you know, economy of old age and so on and so forth. But it's also something that we need to put our minds around, because we haven't done that. And then there's also a very big inequality angle. You know how people used to say that death is the great equalizer, and that, you know, there's no pockets in a shroud? Well, I like to venture that in the future you will eventually need a shroud, but if you have deep enough pockets, you won't need it for a very long time.
Few words.
Please.
Recently I read a very interesting article in Economist magazine. I was quite surprised that Economist magazine devoted the whole several pages exactly on what is going on with medicine, that there is really on the verge of inventing some kind of medicine, which when we shall use it, we shall live up to 120 years. No longer, but 120 years. And then they elaborated a little bit discussion on what will be the consequences. The first consequence will be that family as an institution is not ready for living together, two partners, for 120 years. So we shall need to look how to manage, how maybe change partners. I don't know what does it mean. Yeah. Second was that, again, habits of job and work are also not ready for 120 years, 100 years to, having the same profession. That somewhere in the middle of your age, you will change your partner, you will change your job. Not bad, maybe.
Please, I guess, more years to play golf. So to say. Please tell me.
Well, one argument additionally for us actually living, or at least our children living much longer than we do now, is first of all the development of medicine. This is one of the many sectors where the intelligence that humankind has gathered is actually contributing to helping us to get rid of diseases that have historically killed us, to put it very directly. And one thing in addition to what we have done until now is we should and could go much more personal while treating people. We actually can gather, and in some countries we are gathering personal information about each and every one of us. And believe me, we are very different as biological entities. Probably different medicines work different ways on us. So if we are ready to sequence genomes, for example, making sure what actually is happening in my body and your body and your body, then we can actually offer much more precise cure, despite the diagnosis, basically, let's not go to too many details. This means that once we gather, again, we come to technology, and this is not just ICT booming, this is actually technology helping mankind in every single sector, including medicine. With the help of technology, we can do things like sequencing genomes, gather health data about each and every one of us, and target much more smartly our medicaments, not just trying to cure any disease with penicillin.
And Tavi, among other things, before becoming Prime Minister, was in charge of healthcare in Estonia as a Minister of Social Affairs, which in itself contained healthcare issues and so on. So why don't we go a step back and just understand how we're going to deal with all these implications, because certainly it's going to be a lot of data. Someone is going to be collecting all of the data throughout 120 years or whatever that we're going to live. Not everyone is very comfortable with that. Obviously, every time you press on your screen, and recent study shows that in developed countries, every one of you presses screen 2,600 times a day. So you keep pressing your screen, and someone keeps getting additional information about yourself. And Chinese, of course, are some of the best at that. And by 2020, they will come up with something called a social rating system, where every human being in their country will be ranked upon you know, how good of that person is, based on paying bills on time, posting nice things on social media, driving without violations and so on. And once those that end up at the bottom of the table, they will be not allowed to do things like can't work in the state sector, cannot work in the pharmaceuticals or food sectors, for example, cannot buy an air ticket, cannot go into a nice restaurant or a hotel, and many other things. So that there is going to be, in their view, sort of a push towards being a good citizen, but with the help of enormous amount of data that they plan to collect. So Tavi, you, of course, have been running the country, which is now assumed the chairmanship of the European Union, and wants to really inject this kind of digital sort of a spirit into the rest of the union, and you have been done that successfully in your country. I mean, where do we draw the line between privacy and progress, and when do we say stop, and so on?
Well, the picture you were painting about Big Brother watching every single move and personalizing it back to you is actually terrifying. And this is, I don't know about you, but this is a future I don't want for myself and for my kids. So I think in Europe our approach is somewhat different. We still reckon that all this data is gathered. So each and every one of you who is carrying a mobile phone, please be reminded that you are carrying a GPS. If you have like a mobile phone that is from the last 5 years or so, you are carrying GPS, you are carrying microphones, cameras, and I don't need to continue. So you can become really paranoid if I continue on all those issues. The way that all the difference is actually how we use that data and what are the rules implemented by the government, what type of data can be used and what type of data will be used. For example, using the data of where the mobile phones are at one given point is actually very positive to plan city traffic. If you know that each and every day mobile phones move from one location to another, you actually can search at the accuracy of 1 minute at what time people in Central Kiev want to move to another region, and you can actually plan public transport according to that. You don't need to personalize it down whether it was Ivaras taking the train or Tavi taking the train. That is not of your interest if you're planning the city transport. So in my opinion, the governments should be very, very responsible setting the rules. I know that in European level, EU level, we have kind of ongoing processes how to make sure that any data that is gathered about you is treated responsibly, that you yourself are in charge of that data. And this makes all the difference. If we don't have this in place, none of us will actually trust those digital systems. Let me just conclude by making one example how we have done it in Estonia about health record. Every health case, if any Estonian goes to any doctor, this will will be recorded in one single database that is accessible to other doctors as well, which potentially is helping us to save lives, because all the doctors can check what is your medical history, what cures you have been getting in the past, and so forth. But it's also potentially, let's be honest, a threat for your privacy. If a journalist starts snooping around saying that, okay, the celebrity has this or that kind of injury or this or that kind of disease, that could make the news and be a violation of your privacy. So in order to address that latter issue, what we have done is to make every citizen in charge of that information themselves. So basically, if they feel that something in their health record is too sensitive for the general public to see, they can close it with one click. No doctor will see it, no one will see it. And the other thing, if somebody looks at my health data, which I haven't closed by the way, I still have it for every doctor to see. But if somebody publishes even a small detail about my health, I can log into the health system myself and see the log, which doctors have looked at this particular page. And then I can press charges, which is basically the doctor, in order to snoop around in my health data without a reason and publishing it, will get them prosecuted very certainly, because they have to identify themselves before logging in. And this is just one principle how we should treat very, very important data gathered by the people.
Before we drift into Q&A session and conclusive remarks, one last question before that to Andrus. We talked about disruption just about everywhere, work, sort of the healthcare, other issues. But you know, after spending 1.5 years in government, I realized that things in government are not about to be disrupted, and unless perhaps you're in Estonia. You know, the way agenda is formed, the way laws are being sort of passed in parliament. And again, recent study shows that we live in a world that is becoming less democratic. Only 45% of nations are considered totally free now. And you know, civil liberties and democratic liberties have been violated in a number of very sort of free countries in the past, including Spain and US and Czech Republic and Hungary and Poland and so on. And according to that survey, the world is becoming less democratic for 11 consecutive years. So from your point of view, Andrus, I mean, will we see some kind of major disruption in the way countries are run? Perhaps democracy is at risk, perhaps a new type of system will be adopted. You know, maybe we'll kick out 90% of the bureaucrats, and you know, robots will take over, because what we are taught in schools now is to memorize facts and to follow instructions. This is what robots will be best at, and our politicians sometimes want us to follow instructions and memorize facts. So perhaps leaders are easier to work with robots than with an army of ministers and bureaucrats.
Well, I can imagine, you know, maybe Estonia will be the first country where Prime Minister will be robot. You know? But being more serious, well, I would say again, I'm not very much surprised that there is some kind of reversal in development of democracies. There were several very powerful books. At least I was learning about politics in young democracies from Samuel Huntington, professor from the United States, late professor. He was writing about Clash of Civilizations, but also about young democracies. And one of his last books was called Third Wave. And he was talking about third wave of democratization, which was including also us, you know, Baltic states. But he was always also explaining that that is a habit how democracy is developing itself. There are waves when democracy is spreading into new territories, then some territories are lost for democracy for some period of time. So it's pretty normal. We can guess how democracy will develop itself, you know, in the next decades. I am not so pessimist about. I think that with economical developments also democracy is coming. Of course, there are problems, you know, Africa, Middle East, and so on. There are problems with Russia. But nevertheless, you know, I am optimistic that even Russia can become a more democratic country. But it will take time, and success of Ukraine can have a major impact on developments in Russia itself. Second point, which is again very important, if you look into the history, and there are a lot of very powerful academical books who are explaining, even the titles are very good. For example, one of the book has a title, Why Nations Fail. And the answer was given by some American academic researchers, that the major importance is with institutions. The nations which were able to develop good institutions, which means not only, you know, ministry or some kind of departments, but also social institutions, political parties, associations, and so on, Those countries were much more successful than the countries which failed with the institutions. So that is where we need to look, into that challenge also for such country like Ukraine. And the biggest problem, of course, is that institutions should be able to adapt themselves to very rapid change in society. That is the biggest challenge. When new people, new forces, new social forces are coming into activities, if institutions are not able to integrate their activities into normal way of behaving, then you can have radicalism, you can have populism, you can have everything what is bad and wrong. And unfortunately, in young democracies, again, the lesson from Huntington, in young democracies, usually what is happening, that elections are not strengthening institutions, but elections are weakening institutions. Because people are becoming very rapidly dissatisfied with that country is not developing in such a rapid way as they would like to see. They are voting for somebody who is promising, I will change everything, I will bring miracle. Then the miracle is not happening. People are becoming dissatisfied again, and they are voting for another radical forces, and so on and so on. And that is why exactly ability of institutions, ability of political parties, of governmental institutions to bring results is of crucial importance.
Thank you. We now open for questions from the audience. So raise your hand, get a microphone, introduce yourself, and feel free to ask a question. Please.
Good afternoon. My name is Volodymyr Monastersky, International Law Firm Dentons. Today, Ukraine has become well, my question is about how would you perceive the future of Ukraine in the following terms. To date, the EU-Ukraine association is in place. In order to obtain the EU association agreement, Ukraine has conducted somewhat 100-something reforms in different sectors. In exchange for that, we obtained a visa-free regime. What is happening now? A lot of reforms has been done. The economy is more or less stabilized, but it is growing very, very slow, 1 or 2% per year. Instead, people started leaving Ukraine. This year, Poland issued around 700,000 visas, working visas. Next year, they promised to issue 900,000 years. Also, rumors say that Germany was prepared to issue on an annual basis around 1 million working visas for Ukrainians, but the Prime Minister asked
What is your question? What is your
Yes, my question is, don't you think that if reforms are not backed up with sufficient and fair amount of money, this reform will not make the country moving quickly, just only 1 or 2% per year?
I think first Andrus, because he's behind the Marshall Plan of Ukraine, he knows the answer if he's woken up in the middle of the night. And then Tavi, and I think Francis also has something to add.
Well, very, very good question. It looks like really, I can show you what we are doing, European Plan for Ukraine. That is a recent title of Marshall Plan. We call it now in this way. Why we came with that idea? Exactly because we have our own experience. What was keeping us on track with the reforms back in 1990s? That we saw, and European Union and the Western community showed us very clear goal. If we shall make reforms, we shall become members of EU. And that was keeping us on track. Despite all the political, changes, You know, we are different from Estonia. They are Lutherans, we are Catholics, we are calling ourselves Italians of the North. We are very emotional, you know. We're, you know, doing also possible political mistakes, but because we had this target, we were able to perform all the reforms. Absolutely right, you did a lot of reforms, because EU was showing you good results which you will get, like association agreement, visa-free regime. We started to ask ourselves what is next for Ukraine, you know, if EU for time being is not able to provide you membership perspective, and also the same with Moldova or Georgia. So what kind of new big carrot Europe can bring to you in order to convince you to continue with the reforms? And that was why we came down with this, you know, Marshall Plan, 5 billion euros, you know, annual investment into real economy, which will bring growth of economy up to 6 to 8%, but with a very simple condition. You need to continue reforms. There is a need to agree on what kind of reforms you will perform in order to have this amount of money. BRD is ready to to provide money. No, I'm joking a little bit, yeah. They are doing a great job. But that is exactly why we came out with that idea. I came here from Brussels. I spent several days in Brussels recently. I see that really it's moving forward. I hope that in some or another way, such kind of what Germans are calling new flagship initiative will be approved. Exactly, you know, just both to answer the needs of your economical development, but also to bring an instrument how to keep motivation for reforms in your country. Because we know from our own experience, you know, in order to keep motivation for reforms, the governments, the society needs to see very clearly the result which will be achieved with those reforms.
Well, first of all, I agree with what Andres just said, and I won't repeat it, but talking about the Estonian experience, what we have felt is that the goal of becoming member of EU was the best kind of list to do in order to go on with the reforms. That was actually helping us a lot to know what to do. I would say, with all honesty, that about 90% of those reforms we had to do were actually more useful for Estonia than for reporting to Brussels. These are things that you have to do. Brussels is just, you know, keeping the track and helping you in that. So for us, it was obviously a success story. And with those reforms, you lay this kind of foundation with what investments, civil society, and so forth can build. Now, if I were to advise the Ukrainian government, I would say that you would have the potential to go further than just the list of reforms in order to, you know, be eligible for help or be eligible for membership. I think Ukraine has a potential, just like Estonia and Lithuania had some years ago, to have a potential to take the next step, to, for example, use technology to become much more innovative than many of the EU countries today are. Let me give you one example. How most countries, I would say almost all countries in the world, identify people. They will invite you to meet, you know, a civil servant, for example, and to show a passport. That's something that is printed on a paper or whatever this material is, looking like paper. Does this seem to be the only way of doing that? It is like, you know, the only payment option would be giving you cash on paper. And we know that the credit card was invented in 1950 already. A credit card is not the most innovative or most secure way of payment today, but that was invented in 1950. And while identifying people, we still show our passports. So imagine if all of the Ukraine would start using digital identification, which is properly safe and secure, so that you don't need to go to public offices or you don't need to physically be present. this is something that we have done in Estonia for quite some time, and believe me, that is saving us time and money and helping us to develop much faster as an economy. I could bring other examples, but the point being, as Ukraine in many cases is designing the country without legacy, there is a huge chance of skipping some of the kind of levels that most of EU has stepped on, and hopefully Ukraine can become even more successful than some of the EU countries that are somewhat reluctant to the technological progress. So in this I see a huge potential, and I really hope that that we will witness that in Ukraine.
Just to say, you're asking a very important question, and I think part of the answer is, I agree with what the colleagues have said. Obviously, they've gone through that process in their own countries. Is that you don't reform for the EU, you reform for Ukraine. And by the way, once you've reached the level where you can be an EU member, then the question of whether there's a track to accession will become irrelevant, because it will self-impose. You know, and Ukraine will be able to say, I've done all of these things, I belong in the club. And at that point, there's no reason to not open the doors of the club. I'm convinced of it. Of course, it's not the EU policy today. And just to make it clear, I'm not speaking on behalf of the EU, and the EBRD is not an EU institution. But I'm convinced that if Ukraine does the right reforms, then it will be welcome at some point in the club. The other thing that I'd like to say is technology is going to hit different countries in a different way. What you were describing, Avaras, about this Chinese invention of, you know, rating people by social media is of course a scary future. But how about we use a little bit of technology in this country to make sure that we reduce the level of cash in the economy? How about we use a little bit of technology to, as has been started actually when Avaras was in government, to pay back VAT electronically? Doesn't that reduce corruption? Isn't that a good thing? And so having more technology in a society like Ukraine is going to help fight corruption and reduce the income gap between where Ukraine is today and where it should aspire to be. And secondly, I'd like to say the technology progress is going to work in different ways. You might see, for example, right now Ukraine has a huge cost advantage. But that's because there's labor, right? So if you have more technology content to labor, then advanced economies will be tempted to re-onshore their manufacturing, and that's bad for Ukraine. And there's also always going to be an attraction, regardless what you hear in the West, in the US, against immigration. There's always going to be an attraction, especially looking at the demography of some of the Western European countries, for skilled labor. And that's what you were describing. So that's a big danger, right? And so how do we bring people back home? How do we create conditions for people to flourish here? Well, the country has to invest in information and communication technologies, hugely in education as well, not just for the students, but also for the professors themselves, for doctors, and so on and so forth. And of course, build institutions, improve the governance of the institutions that exist. Another example of technology and how it should be used. Yesterday, the Cabinet of Ministers voted for this business pressure relief law. Well, it's a great law, and it relies on technology, right? You cannot go and do a raid on a company without having a camera on. Otherwise, the results of the raid are null and void. That's great, because then, you know, we all see these raids. Right? We all know what they are for, most of them, okay, or many of them, and they are not for legitimate purposes, many of them, right? So having a camera there, having the way to check that the law enforcement authorities are not just there to seize confidential information from your competitors because you paid them to do so, well, that's a big progress in this country. So having Ukraine grow more, I think, rests on reforms that will attract investment. Right now, if you look at investors, my impression is that they're not looking at Ukraine enough. They're looking at other countries more than they're looking at Ukraine, and that is primarily because we have in this country the image of a country that is in fact not very welcoming to investors, where it's difficult to do business. You know, it's like on a sea chart when you're the captain of a boat, right? You have an area there that has lots of reefs, all right? So a lot of the boats in the modern world, like, take a wide, passage around this area with a lot of reefs. Well, it's time to start working on the reefs.
Thank you. Let's take a couple more questions. Have Andrus answer one, and then we'll let him catch the flight, and then we'll conclude. Any other questions? Okay, then why don't we simply conclude, and then here it's very clear that the world is very challenging from my point of view. I'm a big fan of going forward and employing more things like reverse mentorship. We spoke with you. I mean, it's always good to seek advice from elderly people, but it does appear that not all the things in the future is clearly understood by them. So turning to our kids for advice, the 20-year-olds, is going to be increasingly sort of a more important. And I'm sure, Tavi, at the age of what you were Prime Minister?
34.
34, so we already have a 31 running a country, and it's only a matter of time until we have 20-somethings from my point of view. But since Andrus needs to leave, what would be your sort of advice in terms of our view, which countries will succeed and which countries will sort of be less fortunate going forward, given all the challenges that lie ahead?
Well, my answer would be very simple. We shall be, first of all, we shall become better than Estonians. And then, together with Estonians, we shall become better than France. And then Ukraine will come from behind, and will overcome all of us. Why? Because I think that in the future, the nations and the countries which are hungry of success really will be much more dynamic and will have a benefit of really moving forward with all the new technologies, with all the new developments, much more rapidly than those countries which have a benefit of luxury life for quite a long time, like France. That's my very simple conclusion.
Thank you, Andrus, and thank you for what you are doing for Ukraine.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
That's okay. We'll still be making better wine than Lithuania, that's for sure. But jokes aside, I don't know who's going to come on top on this race, and I must say I see in my own country now the signs that there's some enthusiasm that has come back with a younger president, and so there's a wind of change that is blowing in France. But it's not the topic of this conference today. I think the countries that are going to win in the future, if you look at countries, first of all, I assume that I strongly believe that countries still matter, right? I know there's people that say, oh, multinational corporations are more powerful than countries. Again, that's a fair weather assumption. When it's time to decide to go to war, multinational corporations have nothing to say, and it's countries and it's political leadership, and politics trump economy anytime there's a contest between the two. But I think the countries that win are the ones that actually manage to create an attractive investment environment, and an attractive environment for people to come and work there. Because then they become beacons for people to want to work there, and these people bring ideas, they bring innovation, they bring wealth, they bring competition. If you look at Lviv today, it is a city that has more inequality probably than a few years ago, but it's also a city that is flourishing because of all of the IT specialists that are in that city and are bringing and renovating the city center, and also demanding, by the way, of the authorities that they actually resolve this trash problem that has been spooking the city for the past few years, and so on and so forth. So you bring these positive dynamics by creating an environment when people know that, you know what, if you want to set up shop in Lviv, it's actually going to be easier than in other places in Ukraine. It's not yet as easy as it's going to be in Georgia, certainly, but it still is easier than in other places in Ukraine. So they come there, and then academics come, and then centers of excellence are created. And this positive dynamics, I think, is what is going to drive countries to success. And I'm sure that Ukraine has what it takes, and it needs to want it.
Well, I actually agree very much on that, and I think that this competition or this kind of positive hungriness that Andrius described is very, very healthy. Estonian drive for success has not only been resulting from us being very poor in 1991 when we got our independence back, but it was also knowing that 80 kilometers from us is Finland, that used to have a similar living standard in the 30s, and now they have like several times more money per capita than we have. Are we kind of worse people than they are? Of course not. Are Ukrainians objectively worse than the French or Estonians or Lithuanians? Of course not. So basically, the living standards have to kind of move towards each other. And I think, again, you know, I start kind of repeating myself by bringing digital to every sentence, but here again, Kofi Annan and many others have said education is the biggest equalizer in the society. I would add that the second biggest is digitalization. So it used to take us a few days to get one message from France or Estonia to Kiev, and then another day to get it from here to Kharkiv. Now, today, you put it in the internet or send an email, like that it's everywhere. So in principle, the distances become obsolete or less important, which also should act as equalizers. Now, second point being, which countries will succeed and which fail? I think many of the wealthy countries today have a very serious problem not recognizing what are the future employment models and what the technologies can actually bring. Let's take a simple case like Uber or Taxify. Here in Kiev, they are legal. And that's logical to make it legal because it's a new way of working, it's a new platform for transportation. What harm can it bring if people offer you services to take you from one place to another? No harm brought. But in countries like, and now I don't mention them, in many countries they make it illegal. You know, let's pretend it never happened. Let's pretend nobody even thought of things like having apps for calling yourself a taxi. Let's, you know, have this dial-up calling somebody who physically then sends you a taxi maybe in like half an hour or so. Does this sound, you know, good idea? I don't think so. I think Ukraine already by enabling Taxify and Uber in the streets is being more innovative than many other EU countries that are kind of very established and very proud of their wealth and position. And the same thing applies to technologies like self-driving autobuses. You know, today in my hotel room, few floors up, I saw that there was an accident with an autonomous vehicle, and that's big news. You know, BBC is telling about accident. Come on, there are car accidents in Kiev every single day. So do we kind of forbid all the cars? Of course we don't. Let's just, you know, learn from the accident and let's make the self-driving vehicles possible, because this will bring us additional prosperity. And believe me, if Ukraine makes them legal and half of EU is not making them legal, the living standard in Ukraine in comparison to this half of EU that is not progressive will rise. That is, you know, I'm not just giving you a couple of examples, but basically this applies to every single field. And let me conclude by mentioning it also in the public sector. I believe that many of the things, how the public services can be provided to people, can develop in such pace as well. In order to get the public service, you still need to show up in several offices, right? You need to go there physically, show your passport on paper. Imagine, you know, let me put it this way. 10 years ago, when I wanted to travel to Ukraine, I went to my travel agent physically. 5 years ago, I called my travel agent and booked my hotel and flights. Today, this is all I need. I have booking.com, I have bookinghouse.ee, I book my flights here, I book my hotel here. Now imagine if this would apply to all public services. Registering your child's birth, changing your address, booking a doctor's office. The technology is there. Booking.com uses it. I can book this very hotel for my next holiday. without ever meeting anyone. So why should it be more difficult for a public service? And if Ukraine is among the first countries who finds that this is the way to go, I believe that nothing is impossible in terms of wealth and living standard.
Nothing is impossible. I like it. Since we have another minute, I will just take liberty and also sharing with you what Alibaba founder Jack Ma, how he concluded a similar type of session at World Economic Forum. And since this is a public sort of a side debate, and he gave advice to every government in the world to focus on 30, 30, 30 to make tomorrow more inclusive than it is today. And he said, first of all, every technological revolution takes 50 years. First 20 years, technology is being founded, and another 30 years, we will see the sort of the implications of basically those technological advancements. The second 30 is look at the 30-year-olds, because they will be building the tomorrow, the reverse mentorship. And the third 30 is that governments should focus on businesses that have up to 30 people. And he quotes here Forrest Gump, who said people don't make money catching whales, people make money catching shrimps. Yeah, so I thank our panelists, Francis, good friend, and Tavi, good friend, for your very interesting insights and remarks. And as Tavi said, nothing is impossible. And on this positive note, I thank the audience as well for participation. Thank you.
Thank you.